Good morning. How we doing? Is it okay? Man, it's a great day to be together. As Christians, we're told to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, which is tricky for us because sometimes people go through hard things and we're called to enter into their difficulty and then other people rejoicing and we're called to enter into that difficulty, not just live in how we feel. And so, this morning has been a little challenging. We've had a few of our elderly fall and get injured, and so I'm so thankful for those who've really helped them. And I just want you to know everybody's okay. From what I've been told, everybody's doing okay, just fine. And Josh Harder was out there helping. And which is fantastic. And as Jonah has already said, there's big news with Josh and Michaela. I didn't want Josh to get out of this. This is kind of why I'm bringing this up right now. But Josh and Michaela got engaged on Thursday morning, and so we're so excited for you guys, very much so. You guys are Pathway's new power couple, as I like to think of it. And so let me just say, let the marriage advice start pouring in, okay? Just flood them with marriage advice now. Go for it. But let me give you this one word of advice. Do the right thing. And please start with the good stuff, okay? Start with the great things. Start with the good things. When you talk to them, don't be the person that comes along and says, congratulations. But hey, just so you know, right? Don't do that. Don't kick their legs out from underneath them before they even get to the starting line, that kind of thing. And so that day will come, and that's important in life. We want to think about the good things, the glorious things to any real relationship, but even a marriage relationship. We want to think about those wonderful things. But we also know that a loving person will come along and they will tell us things that we should be prepared for, that times will get difficult. I don't know any relationship, any real relationship, or any marriage relationship especially, that doesn't go through times of difficulty. Every real relationship goes through times of difficulty. Right? Real relationships are difficult. And do you know why? Because people are in real relationships, right? Difficulties exist because people exist. Think about that? Right? Here's the thing. Everything in life that is worth doing has extraordinary joys and benefits, right? But all those same things have great difficulties as well. And here's the thing. If you are never told that something is going to be difficult when you try to go enter into that thing, when those difficult moments come, you're going to think something's wrong, right? You're going to think, maybe I made the wrong decision. You're going to think, oh man, somebody tricked me. Someone lied to me. You know what I'm talking about? And then when that comes, you're going to be tempted to bail in the midst of difficulty. And I'm telling you guys, following Jesus is no different. We need to and we want to hear about the glorious joys and benefits of following Jesus. We need to hear about that, especially when you become a Christian. You begin to experience those glorious joys and benefits. But we also need to be prepared for how it will be difficult. And that's what our passage this morning is talking to us about. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Paul writes this to Timothy, but understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at the knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth, men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. But they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men. So Paul tells Timothy in the last days, life is not going to be a vacation. It's going to be really difficult. Paul gives Timothy this command in verse 1. He says, understand this, know this. I need you to know this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. The last days, it's not a reference to the 1999 Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, okay, just so you know. It's a theological reference to the time when Jesus died, was resurrected, and he ascended to heaven. It's from the moment that he ascended to heaven until the moment that he returns again. Okay, so in these two moments where he ascends and when he descends and he returns and judges the world and makes all things new, the Bible calls that period of time the last days. So for Timothy and Paul, not many decades after the resurrection of Jesus, they were in the last days. You and I, Jesus has not returned yet. We are in the last days. And the Bible teaches us that the last days will be very challenging times. Why? Verse 2 says, for people will be. It'll be difficult because people exist. And they're going to be a certain kind of person. And so today, if you are facing difficulty in life, or as you are preparing yourself to face difficulty in following Jesus, God wants to give us 3 truths for difficult times. 3 truths in this passage that we need to bring into our mind as we walk into the very moments ahead of us in this world. 3 truths for difficult times. Truth number 1 is this. It's in verses 1 through 5, and that truth is this. Looks can be deceiving. Looks can be deceiving. We need to remember this in these days. Verses 2 through verses 4, in these 3 verses, Paul lists 18 qualities, if I've counted right, 18 character traits of people who are the cause of difficulty that will bring about this in your life. They exist in these ways, so difficulty exists. And so there's a lot of qualities here. And instead of just going through each and every one of them and picking them apart, what's actually really important to see is you just look at the very first trait in the list, and then look at the very last trait in the list, and you'll get to the very center about what is wrong with us, what's wrong with these people. Okay, look at the very first thing. What are these people marked by? They are what? Lovers of self. What's the very last trait in this list? Rather than lovers of God. They are lovers of self rather than lovers of God. The reason is all of our moral brokenness flows from having this kind of disordered love. That we live with ourselves at the center instead of God at the center. And so it makes sense what we see here in this list. If I love myself, what is that going to lead me to? Well, I'm going to be the next thing in the list. It's going to lead me to be proud, right? It's going to lead me then to be arrogant. It's going to then lead me to be abusive, maybe, to use my position over you, right? If I'm a child in my family, that might lead me to the next thing in the list, to reject the good authority that God has placed over me and my parents, right? That is, if they're godly parents. The next thing says, love of self will lead me then to be ungrateful. I'll always be demanding more. I won't have a heart that says, oh man, I don't deserve this, thank you. I'm not going to have that kind of heart. I won't live a holy life, a set-apart life. Why? Because I'm living with myself at the center. I'm living the way that I want to live. I'll be led to be heartless. Literally, the word is hard-hearted. I will be unappeasable. Nothing will satisfy me, right? I'm not going to ever want to meet you in the middle because it's all about me at some level. Keep going. I'm going to put others down. I'm going to seek to destroy their reputation behind their back. They're going to be what? Slanderous people. Why do you put people down behind their back? Have you ever thought about why you do that? Well, it's because when you put somebody else down, it makes you feel better about yourself. If I cut you down, what's going on inside of me is I'm thinking, well, at least I'm not that person. I don't have that problem. That's self at the center, furthermore, right? If I'm driven by self-love, what's the next thing? I'm not going to have self-control. I'm going to be brutal, which means untamed. I should get what I want when I want it is the idea. If I'm driven by self-love, I get back to the main idea once again at the end of the list. I'm going to be swollen with conceit, puffed up, lover of pleasure. It's about me feeling good, right? So the core of this list is self-love, it's pride. The reason we face difficulty in our relationships and with people in this world is because of our pride, because of people's pride. It's because they love themselves first and foremost instead of loving God. And here's the thing, when I think of arrogance, I think of extreme versions of arrogance, don't we? When we think of the word arrogance or someone who's puffed up, we think of extreme versions of this sort of pride. At least I do. Someone that comes to my mind is the retired NFL wide receiver Antonio Brown. I don't know if you know who this guy is, but he was a longtime wide receiver for the Steelers for a bit of time, and then he got moved around to a bunch of teams because he had such a character problem. And so he did a lot of bad things. And somebody once interviewed him because of all the things that he did, and they said, "What's one of your biggest regrets?" Right? You should have a lot of regrets, Antonio Brown. What's your biggest regret? And do you want to know what he said? He said, "My biggest regret is that I'll never get to see me, Antonio Brown, play a game live. Sure, I can watch the game afterwards, but I can't imagine what that was like for you all to see something like that. It would be like watching the Beatles or Jesus perform at Red Rocks." Right? You see and you hear somebody like that. I don't know the guy personally, but I go, man, that's conceited, right? That's puffed up. That is arrogant. And I just go, wow, I'm not like that. I at least have the wherewithal to not say something like that, you know? He doesn't even have that. You might not have that sense of pride, and I hope you don't. But arrogance has many shapes and sizes. There are hard sides to pride, and there are soft sides to pride, but it's all pride. Like Antonio Brown and what he said, that's like a hard side of pride. It's the person who walks in the room and they're just like, me, 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 me. They keep talking about themselves. They can't wait for you to be quiet so they can talk about themselves. But there are soft sides of pride too that are just as deadly. And it's the person that is constantly just wondering what other people think about them. They might be suffering silently, but they walk into a room and they're like, "What do you think about me? Do you like me? I don't know." And you just feel so insecure and you're so concerned about what everybody thinks about you. That's pride. That's still self at the center. It's self-love. I've said it before and I'll say it 100 times over. If you want to know the difference between pride and humility, pride is what walks into the room and says, "Here I am." Humility walks into the room and says, "There you are." That's the difference. That's the difference. Hard and soft sides, all the same. Many shapes and sizes. It's all lovers of self, rather than what? Lovers of God. Here's the thing. Paul is letting us know what the Bible teaches universally, that you can't love self and be a lover of God. You can't be filled with self-love and say that you love God. Being a lover of yourself places yourself at the center of the universe, and that's the way of the world. That's the old you that Jesus saved you from. It's so you can be delivered from living that kind of life. But let's be honest. I think many of us, with the comfort with which we live our lives, we trick ourselves into believing that we can do both. That we can somehow love God and still love self, still have this filling of self-love. Paul is saying things are going to be difficult because people will love themselves. Those things, love of God and love of self, they do not mix. It's like trying to make a sandwich with spicy Dijon mustard and jelly. Those things do not go together. Peanut butter and jelly, those go together. Those are complementary. Just because it's kind of brown and yellow and you put it with jelly doesn't make it work, right? Those things don't mix. We understand this. Some of you right now are saying that's my favorite sandwich, and kudos to you, right? I'm sure there's an exception here, but that's gross. Those things don't mix. All right, we get this. There's certain things that don't mix. I'm a San Francisco Giants fan. I love the Giants, and I've loved them, this baseball team, since I was a little kid. And do you know what that means? That means obviously that I don't love the Dodgers. I don't love the Dodgers. I can't, right? Could you imagine if I said, oh, I love the Giants. I'm such a big fan since I was a little kid. I'm a diehard. And you go, oh man, you're going to hate living in Southern California because there's a lot of Dodger fans down here. There's a lot of Dodger fans in the church. Could you imagine if I replied like, oh, I love the Dodgers too. Right? I'm a diehard Dodger fan too. Right? I love the Dodgers. What would your response be? I don't think you're much of a Giants fan. Right? Because if you're a Giants fan, you do not like the Dodgers. They are rivals. They are enemies, aren't they? They don't mix. More soberingly, my sister has cancer, like the very bad kind. Not that there is a good kind, but the bad kind, and I love my sister. Could you imagine if I said I love cancer and I love my sister? That does not make any sense, does it? No, cancer is her enemy. It's against her. It's opposed to her. That's dumb, if I were to say something like that. That reveals that the love of my sister is not in me, right? Right? If the system of this world is where everyone lives with love of self at the center and they stand opposed to God, and you love the very thing that is opposed to God, you don't actually love God. They do not mix, these two things. They don't coexist. And what's scary is that these verses that we see here, we naturally read this list and we go, yeah, all these people in the world are like that. They're crazy. All the people in the world do this. But my heading is looks can be deceiving, isn't it? Because do you realize who he's talking about in this passage? It's not a typo, looks can be deceiving. That's a real heading. At this point, we would go, man, it's pretty obvious when you look at the world, they're not even trying to hide it. But here's why looks can be deceiving. These verses are actually referring to people in the church, right? And we know this because of verse 5, right? Verse 5 says what? They have the appearance of godliness. They're playing a part, aren't they? But they're denying its power. We know it's the second clue here from verse 5. It says what? Avoid such people. You and I know that we can't avoid people in this world who don't know Jesus. We're called to love them and be with them and tell them about Jesus. So we're not called ever in the Bible to avoid people in the world who aren't Christians. Right? If that were the case, we'd have to leave the world altogether, wouldn't we? All right, so we know this is talking about people in the church who are claiming the name of Jesus, but they're poisoning the church because at the heart, it's self-love. But on the outside, it's, oh, I love God. Oh, I love God. When we can go through the list and we could picture people sinning in obvious ways, we can think, man, these people in this list, they sound gross. But the scariest thing is that this passage is trying to reveal to Timothy and to us that we can appear to not have these traits, but under the surface, they are alive and well. What's on the outside can look like the appearance of godliness, but on the inside, it's just self-love. It's hollow self-love. Did you know that you can love yourself and do a really good job of appearing like you love God instead? I mean, I have a clean car on the outside. And that's intentional. Because I don't want to drive around town and people go, man, that guy needs to go clean his car. Right? But there are certain weeks that I don't get around to cleaning the inside, maybe month, right? Singularly, hopefully. And I'm not the ones always quickest to be like, yeah, hop in. You know? From the outside, it's great when I'm driving around town, but if I said hop in, you would maybe see a different story at times. And the first things out of my mouth are like, oh yeah, sorry about that, you know, kids, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, I'm going to do that whole thing, right? People, the problem, you know? Or you can say the right things, you can not say the right things, you can do certain things, you can practice certain things, and you can do it all for the image. That's what's scary. But this kind of living denies the true power that Jesus has come to give you in your salvation. Looks can be deceiving. Difficult times exist because deceptive people exist. Truth number 2, though, is this. That's not just one truth. There's more. Truth number 2, just because it sounds good doesn't mean it is good. Again, we see this: avoid such people, for among them are those who creep into households, capture weak women, burdened with sins, led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. What we're seeing here is that those who might be saying something to people, they're sneaking in, they're saying certain things, and people go, that sounds good, and what is it doing? It's capturing people. It's weighing them down. It's leading them astray. There are things that people can say inside the church that sound good, but it doesn't mean it is good. It could sound true, doesn't mean it is true. Well, how are you going to recognize them then? How will you recognize them? Well, this passage helps us a lot. First, in verse 6, it says we can recognize these dangerous people by their methods. These people that you should avoid, that are teachers maybe in the church, you can recognize them by their methods. What is their method? Well, they creep into households and they capture weak women. Okay? The image here is that in a house, back then, they didn't build church buildings and worship in them like we do. So churches met in homes. So what he's referring to is people that kind of creep in unnoticed into these house churches, okay? It's not that people don't know they're there, but that they don't come in and go, here I am, I'm here to, capture you all, right? That's not what they're doing. They kind of sneak in, they're really polite. You're like, I don't really notice that person very much, but he's kind of a wallflower, he's kind of nice, but what do these people do? What's their method? They target weak people. Not meaning physically weak. It's not even saying that women are physically weak. It's not even saying that women are mentally weak or spiritually weak. What this is a reference to here is that in this day and age, women were not learned, right? The men were the ones who would be allowed to learn, okay? But in this society, women were not they didn't have that kind of firm foundation that they could stand on in their faith with the Bible. That kind of thing. So they would go after people who didn't have that solid foundation. So for our day and age, this would be anybody that's maybe a new Christian, maybe who's gone through some tragedy or trauma in their life and they're vulnerable, right? Somebody who's going through a really difficult time. There's a lot of examples of this. People that sneak into a church and they target the people that are weak, the people that are vulnerable, and they go after them. This is their method, right? The second method, though, the second thing here is you can recognize these dangerous people by their motives. You can recognize them by their motives. Look at verse 6 again. What are they? They're people burdened with sins, led astray by various passions. Again, they're just driven by self-love. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's control. Sometimes it's having a certain status, right? Sometimes it's actually seduction or sexual immorality. All in all, there's a motivation. There's a disordered love. There's a desire that's inordinate that's driving them in this way. But thirdly, I think this is the most important one. We can recognize dangerous people by seeing their approach to truth. See that in verse 7? What's their approach to truth? They are always learning, but they're never able to arrive at the truth. They might know a lot about the Bible. They can talk you in circles. They can quote verses, but they actually never arrive at the truth. Have you ever met anybody like that? Have you ever met anybody like that? They talk about the Bible and you're like, that's good, and then there's something they say and you're like, that feels a little off. I don't know what it is. I mean, maybe for example, you might meet someone who says, I just love to read and follow the red letters of the Bible. The words that Jesus said, I just stick to those. The rest of the Bible, don't really care much about it. But the red letters and the Gospels, the words that Jesus said, those are the things that I listen to. Right? That might sound good. You're like, oh, that's great, staying close to Jesus and his teaching. That might sound good, but is that good? Well, not if Jesus quoted all the other parts of the Bible and said that the whole Bible is pointing to him. Right? Then that's not good. The great deception of our age is that saying you've come to believe something or to be absolutely certain about something, the world would tell you that is unwise, that you are traditional, that you are past the times. You're being left behind, right? To leave everything about God as open-ended is humble and wise, the world would say to you, right? Always learning, but hey, we're never going to stand anywhere, you know? Abraham Lincoln famously once had a cabinet meeting with all of his cabinet members, and they were having a really difficult time in conversation, and so he asked them all a question. He says, if you call a sheep's tail a leg, how many legs does it have? And one of the people in the cabinet said, well, 5, of course. And Lincoln said, wrong. It still has 4 legs. Just because you call a tail a leg doesn't mean it's a leg. Right? But we live in a day and age where we're like, well, maybe there's 5. I don't know. Right? Still learning about sheep or something. Right? This is very relevant for us, possibly more than ever in our day and age, because many of us, we don't want to arrive. We actually fear arriving. Right? We talk about like, hey, enjoy the journey. I'm just here for the journey, not the destination. Right? And we know what we mean by that. But we don't want to arrive at a destination. It's all about the journey. We don't want to cross the line. I mean, there are a lot of ways this plays out in our world today. I know many people who love to talk about ideas, but they never want to arrive at a conviction. And this can be tempting, I think, in my own life. Because why? The moment you land somewhere means that you don't land somewhere else. And you just close yourself off to other things. You staked your ground somewhere, and now you're more vulnerable to appear being wrong. Or maybe this is hard for us because we are often obsessed with new things, novel things. We want to learn something fresh. We don't want to arrive at the truth of the Bible because it's an ancient truth, and that would seem out of touch. But this is a very dangerous way to view the truth. It might sound good in our day and age, but this same phrase appears in 1 Timothy, and it reveals how dangerous this way of thinking is. Because in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, it says this, God desires all people to be saved and to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. God desires all people to be saved and to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. So this phrase here, always learning, never able to arrive, is talking about eternal type things. In difficult times, we need to remember this truth from God's word just because it sounds good, just because it's persuasive, it doesn't mean it is good. Well, how can you know what's true then? How can you know what's true then? Well, we get a really important insight in this final truth in verses 8 through 9, and this truth is this, that counterfeit truth isn't sustainable. Counterfeit truth isn't sustainable. We have an interesting example that Paul pulls from here. He pulls from Exodus chapter 7, where God's people, they're captives in Egypt. Remember, these people are sneaking in and they're capturing people, right? It makes sense using that same image. There are people enslaved, they're captured by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They're serving Pharaoh. They're not free to serve God. Okay, and so God sets out to deliver his people, and so he sends to his people, he sends to Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron, and they do all these miracles. And there's this one moment in particular, Exodus chapter 7, where Moses and Aaron, they do this miracle to show God's power. And their staff turns into a serpent, a snake. It's crazy. And Pharaoh brings in these magicians, okay? And they're like, we can do that. And they have their staffs turn into serpents. But then Aaron's staff serpent thing swallows up the other ones. Right? And so the whole point is there's these people, these magicians. Here we learn their names from extra biblical texts in history that Paul seems to believe, that Jannes and Jambres are these magicians that are in Pharaoh's court. And there are these people that are doing these things. They're looking like they have some real power. They're mimicking, they're imitating God's work, God's power. Right? Do you understand? But what happens? God keeps doing more miraculous things, more powerful things. He keeps going and going and going with plagues and other miraculous things, parting the Red Sea, and these magicians can do none of it. point is, at some point, the truth will win out. They could mimic a few things in the moment, but eventually they couldn't keep up with God's truth. They couldn't keep up with God's power. That's the point. They will not get very far. Right? Their folly, their foolishness, which is always contrasted with the wisdom and ways of God, it'll become plain to all. Right? It will all come into the light eventually. Just like it was made clear that through those magicians in Egypt that they were no match for God, that they really weren't truth, that they were doing counterfeit things. God's truth will win out. It's sustainable. This is the great lie of the world, that living outside of God's design, that standing opposed to the truth of God, that living however I want to live, the lie is that our own versions of truth and our sinful living is sustainable. And we falsely believe that. Right? That we think we can live however we want and that we can then sustain that somehow. Right? That it'll endure or something. But this passage is telling you that if you don't live according to God's truth, it won't last, it won't endure, it is always going to be found out. And so Timothy, he's being told here, and we as well, we don't need to fear even if people are swept away in these last days. Even if falsehood becomes fashionable, right? Error can spread, error can be really popular in a day and age, but it will not get very far. In the end, it'll be exposed, and the truth is sure to be made obvious to everybody. Guys, the real deal always lasts longer than the counterfeits. That's how you know it's the real deal, right? I mean, something cheap can look expensive. It can have the appearance of being expensive, but it'll fall apart eventually, won't it? The quality of the thing is what makes it last. I mean, years ago, I made a decision to buy more expensive shirts instead of buying 4 shirts for the same price. Because I learned that after 2 or 3 washes, that shirt I bought that was cheaper doesn't last anymore, right? You can go with a different strategy there, but I learned, right, quality lasts. In sports, the seasons are long. In the playoffs, often, unless you're playing football, the playoffs often are like a best of 7 sort of series. Why? It's so that the best teams will win out. It's so that you can't just get lucky on one game or something like that, right? Everybody lines up for a race, and the people that are the most in shape can line up with the couch potatoes, right? And everyone can start off looking good. But eventually, it's those who are really in shape that will last, and those that are not in shape that will fall off, right? Every competition show that you watch has different competitions, whether it's cooking or singing or dancing or baking, and they do different rounds. Why? It's so that people will be proven over time who is the best, who is the real deal, who is the truest. The real deal always lasts. It always wins out. Truth reveals itself. It's sustainable. Counterfeit truth may look good, but it will be found out. And so if you want to know what is true, don't look for what looks new, but what has lasted. Look for what has lasted. Don't just look for what simply looks good and sounds good, but look for what has been sustainable. Guys, sin and foolishness is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. I mean, I don't know, maybe you're here and you've been trying so hard to make your secretive life sustainable. You've been trying to keep up an appearance while underneath the surface is just a lot of toxic love of self. Maybe you're beginning to feel like your world is spiraling out of control. I don't know. You're beginning to see how this is not that sustainable. I mean, no one who has spent their life loving themselves and trying to keep up an appearance of loving others has lived a sustainable life. I doubt I'm going to be the first. I doubt you're going to be the second. I mean, no one who has created their own versions of truth and tried to live them out has stayed the course of that truth. Eventually you go, I guess I'm wrong, but maybe I'll try this now, right? I'm telling you, you don't have to try to keep up a godly appearance and have this powerless, hollow center of life. You don't have to keep up appearances that says, I'm always learning and just keeping my options open. No, Jesus doesn't offer you an empty version of Christianity. Jesus has come to not only reveal himself as the way and the truth, but to also reveal himself as the life. And oh my, guys, did Jesus face difficulty in this world? Yet, despite all the difficulties he faced, he didn't just have the appearance of godliness, did he? He didn't even just have godliness, did he? No, he was and is God. And so he died so that you wouldn't just have the appearance of godliness, but so that you would experience the power of God in you. He didn't just come and capture weak people and weigh them down in their sins. No, he came to set captives free. That's what he came to do. He wasn't led astray by various passions. He was laser focused on his passion of the cross. He never sought to learn, but never arrive at a knowledge of the truth. No, he is the truth. He is the wisdom of God. He endured difficulty so that in dying for our sins and rising from death, all those who call on him to be saved would receive the promised Spirit and experience the gospel's power, not just empty religion. You could actually be transformed. Here's the thing, there are so many joys in life when it comes to following Jesus. And if you know him, you know what those joys are. But there will also be difficulties. And our text tells us about those difficulties. But it's telling us to take heart. It's telling us that Jesus has won. It's telling us that in the end, all those who have stood with him in this life will realize that they've always been on the right side of history, all along. Because Jesus, the wisdom of God, was crucified and risen and is now at work in calling people to himself, giving them real power, not just the appearance of power. He's giving them real truth, not just their appearance of truth. And he's offering us a sustainable life, not an unsustainable counterfeit.